Hey everybody, Miss Ford here. Today we're going to be making just a very basic cake, a decorated cake that you could use as a birthday cake. It's basic, but it is professional looking. Now, the first thing that you need to do when you're getting ready to bake a cake is you want to get your pans ready. I get a little piece of parchment paper and I set it underneath my cake pan with the bottom of the cake pan down on the parchment paper. And then I just take a pencil and I trace my cake pan. And then I have this circle. And what I'm going to do is I am going to cut that circle out, and it should fit perfectly inside my cake pan. But before I stick it in, I am going to take some butter, some cold butter from the fridge, and I'm going to butter the bottom and the sides of my cake pan. Then I take my little circular parchment paper right in the center, the bottom of the pan, press it down. Then I take my butter again and I butter my parchment. This is going to ensure that my cakes, when they're all done baking, pop right out. So I'm going to be making a layered cake, so I have 3 cake pans all ready to go. Now, some chefs might think that I'm crazy, but I always use boxed cakes when I'm making cakes. I've actually used boxed cakes to make people's wedding cakes. You can dress them up if you want, doctor them up, but the one thing I like about boxed cakes is they're consistent. Okay, so I made the cake just straight according to the box directions. Now, all my pans are ready. Now, the next important thing is to make sure that there's equal amounts of batter in each of my cake pans, because I want those layers to bake equally and at the same time and rise about the same size, because I want them to all be the same exact size. So I am going to be using my digital scale to ensure that I get the same amount of batter in each pan. Okay, so like I said, I like to make my frosting from scratch. When I buy the store-bought frosting, it always has a weird metallic or plastic taste to it. So we're going to do chocolate frosting. The recipe I use is going to be 1.5 cups butter, and it's going to be 1 cup of unsweetened cocoa powder, 5 cups of powdered sugar or confectioner's sugar, same thing, just different names, about 1/2 cup of milk, and about 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. So both cocoa powder and powdered sugar are very light and fluffy, and they can compact if you measure them incorrectly. So they're just like flour, where you would want to spoon it gently into your measuring cup and not pack it down. I have a sifter over my bowl because I'm going to sift the cocoa powder and the powdered sugar together to make sure that I don't have any clumps, because there's nothing worse than having clumps in your frosting. Sift this into my bowl. I just don't want to have any clumps, because sometimes if your powdered sugar, if it's kind of moist or humid where you live, it could get kind of clumpy. And then even if you're beating it into the with the butter to make your frosting, sometimes there's some clumps left over, and it just doesn't have a very nice mouthfeel when there's a clump. Got the last 3 cups of powdered sugar in there. Then to my bowl of powdered sugar and cocoa powder, I'm going to add 3 sticks of softened butter. So I just left this out at room temperature. I did not soften it in the microwave. You don't want to have melty butter when you're making frosting, because it will be incredibly difficult to spread onto your cake if it's all melted. Okay, even though it's not in the recipe, I'm going to add a little pinch of salt, because salt tends to bring out a nice flavor in this chocolate frosting. Then I need 1/2 cup of milk. I'm going to use my liquid measuring cup, not my dry measuring cup. And I also need 2 teaspoons of vanilla. I'm just going to toss the vanilla in there right now with the butter. And I'm going to start mixing it on low. And I'm going to slowly add the milk as I'm mixing it. So the consistency that I'm looking for is something that is still stiff enough to hold a peak, but smooth enough to be able to spread into a thin layer. And this looks just right. So the cake's finished. A good indication of them being done is they start to pull away from the side of the pan, like that, and they have a nice even golden brown color. The other way you can tell is by doing the toothpick test. You insert a toothpick into the highest point of your cake and you pull it out, and you only want to see a couple crumbs. You don't want to see any like wet batter on it. So I have some cooling racks and I've got my cake. I'm going to put the cooling rack directly on top of the cake. Make sure you hold on to the sides of the pan and just flip it over. The cake should pop out super easily, and then just peel off the parchment paper. Now, you want your cakes to be 100% cool or even on the cold side before you start frosting them, because if they're warm at all, the frosting is just going to melt onto your cake and it won't hold a nice stiff frosting. It'll just be a big gooey mess. So we're getting ready to frost the cake. The biggest giveaway, in my opinion, between a Sally Homemaker cake and a professional cake is the leveling and the consistent layers. So a couple things we're going to need. We're going to need a serrated knife. This one's huge. You probably don't need one this big. We're going to need an offset spatula for decorating, preferably. Some type of cake circle. If you don't have a cake circle, any type of big kind of flat plate would be fine. And then obviously a tip, a piping tip, some piping bags. And we're going to start with leveling off our cakes. So I'm going to take my first cake. Since the bottoms we know are nice and flat, I'm going to leave that be and just take a look at this one. So I can see that this area is thinner than this area, and I want it all to be the same thickness. So you're going to kind of get down level. I'm going to start at the thin side and just push the knife gently into the cake as I turn it with my hand. And I'm gently pushing the cake. I can start sawing it once I get into it, but we're just trying to stay nice and level. Now these I do not throw away. I keep the tops of the cakes, and you can eat them as is, or you can turn it into a trifle, or you can make little rum balls with them. Okay, so I'm going to do that to all 3 of my layers. Take my cake circle, and I'm going to slide the cake right onto my cake circle. I'm going to get rid of all the crumbs. I'm going to make sure that the cake is in the center. So I gave the frosting one last whip with my beater before I brought it over here to make sure that it had nice consistent air bubbles. And I'm just going to put a little bit on my cake. Actually, I'm going to lift up my cake, put a smear of it on the bottom, and that will help it stay in place. I'm also going to put a little smear on my turntable to make it stay in place as well. Okay, then I'm going to take my offset spatula, and I'm just going to spread this nice and evenly on top of my cake. If my frosting is a little bit too cold, it might be hard to spread, but as you work it, it'll warm up. If I get crumbs in this part, I'm not going to worry about it. The trick is to keep the spatula down on the cake without lifting it up, and then just kind of spread it to the side, because if you lift up with the spatula right in the center of your cake, it will pull off all your frosting and it'll pull off bits of your cake with it. Okay, so we don't want that. I'm going to take my second layer, place it right in the center, give it a little pat down, get some more frosting, and do the same thing. Now I'm taking care, if I see crumbs on my spatula, I don't want to stick it back in my frosting, because this first layer that I'm going to do is called the crumb coat. So my last layer, I'm going to flip it upside down, because again, I know that that bottom piece, the bottom of my cake is nice and flat and level. I'm going to push it down. Plus, there's less crumbs on this part of the cake. But like I said, I'm not too worried about getting crumbs on this layer. This is called the crumb coat. And what it is it's just a thin layer of frosting that coats the whole thing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to refrigerate it for just a couple minutes until the buttercream gets nice and hard, because the butter in there, butter gets what? Solid when it gets cold, right? So it's gonna harden up, and then it'll be nice and solid for me to put on an extra layer of frosting that will be free of crumbs. Get a little more frosting for the sides. If it's not perfect, we can always decorate, again, to hide the mistakes, by maybe adding a little more frosting on certain areas to make it look like it's nice and 90 degrees. Okay, so that is a good crumb coat. I'm going to stick this in the fridge for a couple minutes, let it harden, and then I'm going to put the rest of my frosting on there. Okay, while we wait for that crumb coat to harden in the refrigerator, I'm going to show you how to get your piping bag ready. So I buy these piping bags. They come in sets of 100. Get them online. These are the 18-inch ones. And I'm going to use this star tip. You can get tips in all different shapes and sizes. Some of them you can make roses out of. The star tip, you can do little rosettes. You can do just plain circles. You can do little beads or pearls. So you're going to cut off, you don't want to cut off too much of the tip of your piping bag, otherwise your tip will just go straight through and then you'll have wasted a bag. You'll have to get a new one. So I start small, smaller than I think. So I only cut off that much, and then I see if I can fit it through. You only need the area that actually has the star piping on it. Oh my gosh, I'm so close. So I'm just going to snip off a tiny bit more, and then with the butt of a wooden spoon, just going to stick it into my tip and push to make sure it's nice and tightly inserted in there. Then I'm going to turn the top inside out, okay? And this is good because it gives me a little handle to hold on to as I'm filling it with frosting, and it also keeps it clean, because if you get frosting on the outside of the bag and then you're trying to pipe things with it, it can become a real big mess. So I don't need a lot. I'm just going to make little rosettes around the bottom with this frosting, with any excess frosting that I have. I want to save enough to help that crumb coat and make sure all the areas of the cake are nice and covered. So now you unfold those, press down on your frosting until it's near the end. So you're going to want to make this, in order to stay clean, kind of cut it off like that with your thumb and give it a twist. Biggest mistake is overfilling your piping bag. It's better to have less frosting in each piping bag than too much, because it's a lot easier to work with. You have more precision in what you're doing, and it's a lot cleaner. So you're going to be pressing from the back, not from the center. You want to put the pressure on the back. It's kind of like a toothpaste bottle, where it's best to press from the bottom rather than pushing it from the center. I know a lot of people push from the center of the ketchup tube, but you want to push from the back. And I'll show you this in a little bit. Okay, so my cake has hardened in the fridge, the outer coating, the crumb coating. So now I'm going to put the rest of the frosting that I have left on top of the cake, and I'm going to evenly distribute it amongst the top and the sides of my cake. Spread it nice and thin on top. Just get it as even as possible, and then just hold the cake spatula in place and spin it with your other hand. You can see it coming over the sides. I'm just gently pressing down just so that I don't have a huge thick layer of frosting on the top. I want the sides to be nice and straight, and I want the top to be nice and smooth. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to clean up the cake circle a little bit because there's some streaks of frosting with just a paper towel. There we go. Then I'm going to pipe little rosettes just along the base. My son's doing a bear crawl down here underneath the table. He's very excited about the cake. And I have some extra frosting, so I could do like little designs. I could do little big rosettes along the top.